Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my NACL Spring Split Week number 3 overview and analysis video. We are really getting the ball rolling here in the NACL at this point. We are really starting to get a good idea of where these teams are landing in terms of their expectations, and the top teams are definitely starting to separate themselves both in a good and a bad way, as we'll talk about a bit more later on in this video. But I'm excited to go over week number 3. I hope you are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect from the 6 series that we got over the course of this week, and did they live up to your expectations? Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions in that regard. But without further ado, let's jump into the content. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 10, kind of talking about whether or not teams are over or underperforming, what my expectations were for them going into the split, going into this week, all of that stuff, and just a general overview of how the NACL is going. I'm interested to know your thoughts and opinions as well down in the comments section, but most of today will be spent talking about the 6 series we got in week number 3. So without further ado, let's get into covering those series themselves, starting with day number 1. And we had a really fun series to kick off. Day number 1 here, it was Blue Otter taking on Luminosity Gaming to start this week of a lot of the top teams really kind of being forced to adapt and evolve, and Luminosity, to their credit, were able to do that in this series by picking up the 2-1 series win. Blue Otter definitely put up a little bit of a fight. Game 2 was pretty in their favor, and there are some good takeaways in terms of being able to get the Viego fed for music, him being much more of a primary option than he was really at any point in 2024 in terms of the resources. Not that he was bad, I certainly don't want to make it seem like that, but they're playing less for lanes and more so for music in 2025 than they were last year, but Luminosity just was a little bit better, and specifically when you're looking at games 1 and 3, this wasn't a close series. I know it feels like it should be close because Blue Otter ended up winning that game number 2, but both of the games that Luminosity won here were pretty dominant, and honestly, game 2 can be looked at much more as an outlier here than it is as kind of the norm, at least in my opinion, with how this went down, and a lot of that just has to do with the carries of Luminosity really stepping up and being super crucial, especially in the back half here. Player of the series for me is going to go to Tactical in the bot lane. He was the best player by far in the deciding game number 3, but he still was really good in game 1 on the Jhin. Just opened up a lot of opportunities for Luminosity. Tactical is way too good for this level. He was good enough to be a pretty average AD carry at the LCS and, tier 1 NA level for quite a long time, even when he was on Immortals and playing for bad teams, even when he was kind of at his worst on TSM. He always was a player with enough upside to really justify a tier 1 spot. It is clear that he is better than a lot of the AD carries at this level, and I think he is kind of proving that, getting to play something really aggressive that he is very known for and very comfortable on, like the Tristana, not going for those Tristana Malphite ultimates that he kind of got called out for a lot of his career here, was a positive, but his ability to just get those resets and take over these games in terms of his damage, pretty ridiculous. We'll talk about Levitate on the other side of this matchup, but I'm just going to say it, there was a pretty big AD carry gap in this series. Levitate was completely out of the game, not only in game 3, which honestly was probably his best game of the series, but specifically in game number 1, where it felt like Tactical and Zeyzal just had all of the pressure in the world. Again, we'll talk about that more when we get to the Otter section of this review, but Tactical was excellent. The other player you have to shout out is Insanity in the mid lane. That rise, that creation coming in from him in the mid lane, moving around the map and, being that big playmaker. What you want to see out of Insanity is him kind of taking the reins and dictating the tempo for his individual teams, and I think that fits really well here. A player like Tomio, he's really good at being able to enable laners, and I would consider his best work on things like Maokai and Sejuani, but you want a mid laner that's going to be super proactive if you want to get the most out of Tomio individually as a player. That's a perfect complement for Insanity because he is just going to go a little bit crazy. He's going to be a main character. He likes to have a lot of those resources, and he definitely made the most of them throughout this series, again, specifically on that rise in game number 3. Fake God was really solid on the top side, even if he wasn't, necessarily gigantically important. Tomio looked great on the facilitators, less so when he had to play a carry in game number 2. It's definitely a trend we're starting to see with him as a player. And then Zeyzal was really, really great on the Braum in game number 3 to be able to provide that peel and just let the Rise and the Tristana take over. It was good stuff from Luminosity. Really not a lot of complaints from me. Their carries kind of being the main players that you're looking out for and, the ones that you wanted to see step up. That's exactly what happened, and their wins were really dominant. Yes, they dropped a game, and they probably shouldn't be dropping games to a team like Blue Otter. Not that Blue Otter is bad, just that Luminosity probably shouldn't be dropping games to anyone outside of the top 3, but they were able to get it done in the end. And then for Blue Otter, I think people are going to be pretty excited that they picked up a win here, at least in a game. They've not looked perfect at the start of this year, but I think there are some encouraging traits to take away from this. Quacker and Music were really good in game number 2. The Shen is actually a really intriguing pick in the current meta. I know it was kind of the counter to Jax in this particular matchup, but the Shen actually put in a lot of work, and I'm interested to see if that's something that does start to pick up in priority. But it was Music on the Viego that really got, to take over the game, got to be the primary option, the main character in that second game. Unfortunately for the rest of this team, they really were outplayed in game 1 and game 3, and game 3 in particular just left a very sour taste in my mouth. The reason that Samikin is getting my dud of the series and not Levitate is because I think Samikin was worse in that deciding game number 3, even if I think he was maybe a bit more consistent and certainly significantly more active over the course of this series. But I very heavily considered giving this to Levitate in the bot lane, not only because I just don't think he really did anything, but because even the plays that he did go for weren't ideal. He was definitely the worst of these 280 carries, and with how much I was hyping up Levitate at the beginning of this year, kind of talking about him being a potential top 3 prospect here in North America, having a potential Scary Jerry-esque glow up over the course of 2025, potentially being somebody that you could look at for tier 1 next year. It's not started off hot for Levitate, I'll definitely say that. This bot lane honestly really hasn't looked all that great. Rovex has looked okay, but he's also had a couple of bad games, like the Blitzcrank was not working super well, especially at the end of game 3. There were some highlight moments. I'm certainly not going to pretend like everything was bad for Rovex. I'm just kind of disappointed in the lack of aggressiveness from Levitate, because he was such an integral piece towards why this team was so successful at the end of last year, and it feels like they've really moved away from that. But Samikin's getting it because the Ahri was bad in game number 3, got completely out-rotated and out-macroed by Insanity on the other side, and of course Insanity is a great player. It's no shame losing to him, especially when he's on something like Rise that does have so much priority and can play make so heavily, but you needed to see more out of Samikin, at least in my opinion. Like I said, Quacker and Music were fine, but Blue Otter are not on the level of Luminosity, and I think that continues to be proven. At the beginning of the split, we did say that they were a tier down from the top 3, but we kind of thought they were going to be the best of the rest. I have major questions about that right now. Number 6 in the power rankings definitely looks like it's a bit more accurate than maybe the number 4 we started off the year with. And then for Luminosity, this is a very nice win. You still need to do a lot more. Like, these are series that you should not be dropping games in. You can't really be faltering against the middle tier teams. Of course, they're still leveling up, but these players have quite a bit of synergy already coming in from last year. Tactical really being the only piece that's not used to playing with others on this team, and he's the one that's really popping off right now. The talent on this team is extraordinary, but there still are some minor things that I think they need to work on. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and it's a really interesting matchup on paper. Near Airport taking on Conviction, and Near Airport is going to pick up the 2-0 win with an especially dominant win in game number 2. They look excellent throughout this entire series. Again, game 2 really felt like the culmination of everything they've been building towards throughout this split up until this point. They've certainly not gotten an easy schedule to start the year. No real free wins for Near Airport just yet, but they're still able to go to 2-1. They're still able to move to 5-3 in terms of their game score across this split, and things are honestly just looking really good for Near Airport, about as well as they looked in the open qualifiers. They've carried a lot of that momentum over here to the NACL. Conviction is a really good team. They probably still are the best of the rest. They certainly were graded as such after their fantastic week number 1. They did not play, obviously, in week number 2, and, even though they didn't put up the biggest fight here, there still are a lot of good things to take away, I would say, for Conviction, just maybe not in terms of the second game of this series. So we'll talk about that when we get to them, but player of the series is super obvious to me. It's got to go to Pobelter in the mid lane. What a dominant performance from him as a facilitative, dominant engage threat, like playing with jungle, playing for bot lane, setting up Tristana, making sure Xin Zhao could go anywhere he wants. Like, Pobelter just did everything for the team in this series, and especially in that second game, you just have to give him a lot of credit. He is one of one right now in terms of the mid laners in the NACL. I honestly don't even feel all that crazy saying that. There's not a single mid laner in tier 2 that I would take over Pobelter in terms of how he has played. This guy just does not make mistakes. He does not screw up. He is not in the wrong place at the wrong time ever. He is so unbelievably hyper consistent, and that really is very valuable at this level. And I think people underestimate what the high highs look like for Pobelter. I think some people just say, oh, he's like a Larson-esque type of player where he's going to play a little bit safer in the early game and then be kind of a team fight threat, but is better off as like a secondary or tertiary carry for the team. And while I agree that that's like a perfect scenario, and in this case he kind of is that, because Spica, Double Lift, even TF Blade, they're going to be taking more of the resources. It's not that I don't think Pobelter can carry, it's just he does such a good job at letting everyone else carry that you don't really need him to be the number one guy, but he certainly can be. Look at the Azir game in game number 1. He played that phenomenal as well. He was just better than Darkwings throughout this entire series. Again, we'll talk about that, but I've been so impressed with Pobelter. I don't think he's played a single bad game, even a single average game, since he came back to pro play. Even in their losses, this guy has been nothing but quite frankly, exceptional since he came back in the OQs and now in the NACL. I'm very excited to see more of Pobelter, and Spica is obviously the other player you really got to shout out here. Doublelift will get his credit because he did take over with those rocket resets on Tristana in game number 2, but Spica was definitely the other playmaker that kind of blew things open at the back half of that second game. Kisno unfortunately getting caught out, trying to just go a little bit too far forward on the Wukong. He still made some interesting plays in that game, but Spica really proving his dominance. Xin Zhao can be a very difficult pick to play into if you're playing from behind, and Spica definitely showed that off. Doublelift got all of those resets, ended up taking over, had a ridiculously high kill game in game number 2. Even if a lot of it was set up for him and he was definitely more of the follow through, you still have to follow through. You have to be a good enough AD carry to be able to capitalize on what players like Spica and Pobelter are creating for the team. Biofrost has continued to be very nice in the support position, kind of like Pobelter in that he doesn't really have bad games, but I would say the highs have been a little bit lower for Bio in terms of the playmaking. I've been ridiculously impressed with Pobelter in that regard, and Bio's more so been a part of the team, but that's certainly not a negative considering how many mouths to feed there are on Near Airport. And while TF Blade hasn't been a main character, I've really liked that he's been willing to pick things like Scion in game number 2, or even something like Mbessa, which yes, can kind of take over games, but doesn't really need a lot of resources on the top side. You're not just seeing counterpick after counterpick coming in for TF Blade. It's been a lot more versatile than that. I think Near Airport is a great team, and I think they might even get better over the course of this year. It's clear that they actually are taking this very seriously, and even if they're not scrimming as much as a lot of the other teams, there is such an inherent talent to these players that if they actually do take their scrims that they are doing seriously and they lock in for game day, I still think they can be one of, if not the best team in the NACL. And then for Conviction on the other side, it's just unfortunate you weren't able to establish pressure. You made some pretty big mistakes at the beginning of game number 2 that really put you behind the 8 ball, and once you lose pressure with Talia Wukong in the middle of the map, it's really hard for those champions to be effective. Darkwings is going to get done of the series for me, mostly for that Talia game in game number 2, although I think Kisno had to be considered, if only because he did, step up too far forward and really put his team on the back foot, but he at least tried to turn things around by catching out Doublelift down in the bot lane and just trying to be proactive with the plays he was making. It really felt like Darkwings was always on the back foot throughout this series, and whether it was on the Victor or on the Talia, it never really felt like he was in the same time zone as Pobelter on the other side. I think Darkwings is fine. He's a good player at this level. I wouldn't say he's been a spectacular player at the tier 2 level, and Pobelter right now is playing as a top 1 mid. I'm not surprised to see this outcome, but it is a bit disappointing. I think it's also worth noting that Manui can just be a little bit inconsistent when playing from behind. I really don't love Aphelios in this current meta. I think it's very dangerous to play these immobile hyper carries and really rely upon them to be like the options to win the game. And while Chrome I think was fine across this series, Manui just wasn't able to get the setups there, and especially when he has to play from behind, he's still definitely learning what he can and cannot get away with as a support in terms of moving around the map, and sometimes he can be punished a bit more than normal supports will be for those movements. Hoarder I think was definitely not as effective as he needed to be. He was dominant in their first 2 series, probably the best performing top laner through the first couple of weeks, but could not hold up in this matchup to TF Blade, even if it wasn't entirely his fault. It just really didn't feel like Conviction was on that level, and even if I do think they still are the best of the rest, it has become abundantly clear that top 3 is so much better than everybody else in the NACL. It's top 3 and then like a giant gap between 4, 5, and 6. As much as I like teams like Conviction and CCG and Blue Otter and, Supernova and Winthrop and even Apex Mission Impossible and Polestar, like the bottom tier parts of the NACL, there's just a difference between what Near Airport even can do, and we've already seen that they are beatable by the other top 2 teams. It's crazy the talent level we have right now at the top in the NACL, and I think Near Airport definitely epitomizes that. Pobelter has been spectacular. Doublelift and Spica have looked as good as you could possibly ask for. Same thing for Biofrost and TF Blade, considering this is his first foray into competitive, looks as good as you could ask for in that regard, and a lot more versatile than I was anticipating. So really like what we saw about Near Airport, and I'm excited to see more of them moving forward. Then moving on now to day number 2, our middle day of the week, and we kick off day 2 with a matchup between CCG Esports and DarkZero Dragonsteel. And DarkZero is once again going to pick up a 2-0 win. That's 3 2-0s in a row for DarkZero. They move to 6-0 to start the year. They look as dominant as you could possibly ask for, and this might be the most dominant of their outcomes so far in 2025. We kind of talked about how DarkZero to me is easily the number 1 team in the league heading into the year. I think a lot of people had Luminosity either at the top or at least close with DarkZero. I was pretty bullish in my primer about how I felt there was a bit of a gap, and I just was shocked that people weren't taking DarkZero DarkZero nearly as seriously as they did last year, and you know what? That's been proven to be almost entirely correct. This team looks unstoppable at the current moment. Everything is clicking, and it's just all working. Like, we were concerned that, Sajed coming into the bot lane could perhaps kind of change the chemistry, change the outlook of this team, because Scary Jerry had been part of this core for Maryville for so long, but Sajed has come in and been excellent for this team, been better than he was last year on FlyQuest, which was already a really great debut year in Tier 2, and you have players like Spyrax who are popping off as carries now more than ever. Yuji has started playing facilitators, which is how you know this team feels like they can dominate everybody they're going into. Zamudo's been the best top laner in Tier 2, Zyko has been the best support in Tier 2. It's just all working for DarkZero right now. There is nothing to complain about. This was a sub 25-minute win in game number 2. And then for CCG on the other side, I like this team. I do think that there is like an inherent floor with these players that is going to help them when they start playing off against teams that are around their skill level, but it's been very difficult to really understand where exactly they are at the current moment, because they've either played teams that they absolutely should beat, I think it was Supernova at the beginning in week number 1, or they've played teams that they absolutely should not beat, like Near Airport and DarkZero, that it's totally justified to lose to. That being said, they got slaughtered in this series. It was not even remotely relevant. It was not close. They were not in the same time zone. They're not even on the same planet in terms of what this series was, and we'll talk about that a bit more, but honestly, not a ton to discuss when it comes to actual gameplay. Yeah, DarkZero was great across the board. Take whatever kind of positive spin on that you want to give. Player of the series can go to basically anybody. I think it should go to one of Spyrax, Sajed, or Zyko. I think it's those three that really stood out the most to me in terms of creation or follow-through in this series. I'm giving it to Sajed in the bot lane because, man, that Misfortune game, like, he just did so much damage. He goes deathless throughout these 2 games, and honestly, if Spyrax had gone deathless, he probably would have gotten player of the series, but it is what it is. Sajed is going to get the nod here. 21-0-7 is ridiculous, but he did show it on tape. Like, can you make the argument that he got, set up by Zyko and Spyrax and Yuji and even Zamudo to have a really easy job? Yeah, I think it's certainly an argument you can make. Did he follow through about as well as anybody could ever hope to follow through in this instance? Absolutely. It feels like he's focusing a lot more on his individual performances in these team fights, and it's clearly showing on tape, in my opinion. And then, obviously, Spyrax deserves a big shout-out. He's been incredible. I know I just went on this big tangent about how Pobelter has been the best mid laner in the NACL. Spyrax is certainly giving him a strong run for his money. I think this is the best he's ever looked at the Tier 2 level, not just because the team is winning and the scorelines look good, but because he's playing a style that I think I was always concerned he wasn't going to be able to dominate with. And I really do think this shows that, mechanically speaking, he is just better than a lot of the players at this level, because not only can he be that top-tier facilitator, that Niski-esque player that moves around the map and makes his jungler's life 1,000 times easier, but we've seen over the course of this split, he can carry games in terms of like the damage he's able to output and the resources he's able to allocate for himself. It always felt like Yuji and Spyrax were a good duo because they had like such a clear playstyle. Yuji could be such a dominant carry coming out of the jungle with Spyrax giving him so many resources, but that's been entirely flipped on its head so far in 2025. Yuji looking great on Poppy, being able to set up Misfortune or Victor or whatever, kind of needs to be set up. Yuji has looked excellent. Zamudo has been easily the best top laner in the league. He's been more dominant than anybody you could even remotely talk about at this level. We thought that last year was kind of the breakout. He might re-break out again this year in terms of just how much better he is than everybody else. And it's not like Zyko is not the best support at this level. He is the best support at this level. It's just ridiculous, the talent that DarkZero have. And honestly, if they drop a series, I'm honestly going to be shocked at this point. They've done everything they can to prove that they are by far the best team in the NACL, and I actually think a perfect split might be on the horizon. And then for CCG on the other side, what do you even really want me to say? Like, they didn't have a shot in this series. They were nowhere near close to being able to compete. Credit to Array and Breezy for not losing as hard as everyone else on the team. I guess that's really the only positive takeaway, but Aojun in the mid lane, yeah, he's done of the series, like 2-15-2. 15 deaths across 2 games is entirely unacceptable at the pro level, and I get that he's a new player, and, he's definitely going to go through his own, ups and downs. He's going to have some positive and negative plays, but this is bad. Like, this is not knowing how to play from behind, even at the baseline level. I get that this organization really likes him, and I liked him. I liked the tape I saw in the ACL, but this is a different ballgame, taking on, DarkZero, Dragonsteel, Maryville, whatever you want to call them, and Aojun was certainly not ready for it. He is the easiest possible choice for Dead of the series, and Dardoch was really bad. It felt like a lot of the things he was trying to create weren't working out. Yuji did a great job to really stifle his gameplay. Crimson was not even close to being able to compete with Zamudo. He did basically nothing throughout this entire series. There's like no positive takeaway for CCG. You just kind of have to hope that you can put this behind you and move on. I think the positive takeaway is that DarkZero's kind of been doing this to everyone, and so you're not, the worst team in the league just for losing like this, but man, you gotta have this series be out of sight, out of mind, because this is as bad of a series as you could possibly ask for. But for DarkZero, this is fantastic. They look dominant. They look unstoppable. 6-0, I think, undersells just how good this team is. This is the best team in Tier 2. This would be a borderline top 3 or top 4 team in Tier 1, in my opinion, at the current moment, and I think they proved that game over game. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2 here, and it's a battle between two teams that certainly had lower expectations, we'll say, coming into this year. It was Apex Mission Impossible taking on Polestar, and AMI is going to pick up their second series win of the split already. They're going to move to 2-2. This team's sitting now at 4-6, which isn't like the greatest record in the world, but remember, this team's goal is to not be bottom 2. If they can stay in the top 8, if they don't have to go to the re-promotion tournament, to re-qualify back here to the NACL moving into summer, I would consider that a gigantic positive for them, considering what the expectations were and just how little experience this team has overall. Obviously, Pulse has a very similar argument on the other side, but AMI has been significantly more successful, and them walking out of this series with a dominant victory in game number 3, definitely looking like the better team across these 3 games, is really encouraging. For Pulse, on the other side, this was probably your last winnable series. You're sitting at 0-4, you're now sitting at 2-8, and 2-8 is really not all that bad considering what the expectations were coming into this, but I think at this point we can pretty clearly say that this team is going to be a pretty big underdog to win any series for the rest of this split. This, like I said, was probably the last one that you felt even remotely confident in any way, shape, or form, and they were not really in this one. AMI was definitely the better of these two teams, and that puts Pulse pretty clearly at number 10, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Baz in the bot lane. The AD carry here looked awesome throughout the entire series. I thought he was great on the Xayah in game number 1, did a lot of damage and really kind of pushed the team forward in that regard. Low Jazz was also excellent in that game on the Wukong, which we will talk about, but it's really the Ashe arrows and the lane dominance of game number 3 that make me feel a lot more comfortable. Not only that, but only dying once throughout this series is obviously a really big positive. It feels like he has started to position really well. I was really impressed with the way that he was playing out a lot of these fights over the course of this series. He just feels a lot more comfortable on these champions that have other options other than just right-clicking, right? We know he's kind of a Jhin aficionado. That's the definite scouting report on Baz heading into the NACL, but things like Ashe kind of fit into that as well. Even Varus in game number 2, I think, looked pretty solid. Baz, in general, just felt like the most consistent player on AMI. He really didn't have any bad plays, even in their losses, and so I felt pretty good about giving him player of the series, but I do want to shout out basically everybody else here who I think played really well. I think Low Jazz was really close to getting player of the series for me. If he didn't have, I would say if he was a little bit more aggressive on the Jarvan in game number 3, then maybe I would have, given it to him. His Wukong in game 1 was excellent. He probably was player of the game in game number 1, and he was even fine on the Pantheon in game number 2 that they ended up losing. I certainly think he has looked better than I have anticipated so far at the NACL level, but, Fimony looking awesome at the end of game number 3 on the Ziggs, Decoy looking really unstoppable on the Gnar, just really taking advantage of Dr. Calculus on the Sion, and Pocus doing a great job to set everything else up for the rest of the team. I would say this is his best series so far in Tier 2. I was just really impressed with AMI across the board. You could make a really strong argument for basically anybody on this team being the standout player, and that's exactly what you want to see from them. You don't want to see, this player stepped up and, they kind of got lucky that they were able to get them super fed and play through them, and so they ended up winning. No, this just felt like a really coordinated win. I'm not trying to sit here and say that they are an upper tier team, but this team's macro is really good. They understand exactly what they're supposed to do from ahead, and they're not nearly as, far down, I would say, in terms of my expectations as I expected them to be going into the split, which is really exciting. They're closer to being number 7 or number 8 than they are to being number 10, which is great. But for Pulse on the other side, I think the only positive here is that they won game number 2, and at least that's something. I know it's not a fantastic takeaway, and, some of these players were okay. I think Bio and Adam at least tried throughout a lot of this series. Bio was so aggressive, and that was really epitomized by the Lee Sin in game number 3. He was trying to make stuff happen in the early game. He certainly was not willing to let these games get out of hand as quickly as they did. Unfortunately, they just didn't really have the pressure or the priority to be able to keep up, and the Lee Sin ended up not being relevant enough. Adam, I think, also was totally fine. It was actually really good on the Talia in game number 2, and Adam has been, surprising to me in terms of just what he is as a player. Super feast or famine as a mid laner. The good games look good, the bad games look really bad. I'm excited to see where he ends up going. The mechanical ceiling is higher than I expected it to be. I've been impressed with what I've seen in terms of his laning, even if it's not always good. It's just he's going for the right plays, and hopefully he's going to be able to get a bit more consistent in terms of making them work. But the rest of this team was really not on form today. Dr. Calculus, definitely the weaker of these two top laners, even if he wasn't all that bad on the Gwen in game 2. The Sion did not work out in game 3, and then Hub and Tubbs were definitely outplayed. Tubbs is going to get my dead of the series here. He just wasn't really all that consequential on the engage threats, and then the Senna did not work out in game number 3. Hub never really got to get a good bullet time off on the Misfortune. Pulse just were behind the 8-ball, and like I said, this kind of was their last chance to really be, a series winner here. They're sitting at 0-4, and they've already played some of the weakest teams in the league. I just don't feel particularly good about this team moving forward. There's a chance that maybe they could win a series, but this is pretty much locked in to be a bottom 2 team at this point unless something crazy happens or, they change their roster entirely or the team just figures something out. Like with the form that they're in, they are very clearly number 10 in the league, and I can't say that I'm all that surprised, but it is a bit disappointing. And then for AMI on the other side, nice win, 2-2. This team's sitting at 500. They are way out of the bottom 2 right now. Now things don't get easier for them moving forward. They've kind of gotten a lot of their easy matchups out of the way early on in the split, but if they can keep up this level of, priority in the early game, and especially if their macro can translate into these matchups against these other middle of the table teams like Winthrop and Supernova and, Blue Otter, CCG, Conviction even, there are opportunities for them to be able to generate leads, and this team is better than I was expecting them to be. I'm excited to see where they're going forward, and, there's a real chance that they might not be bottom 2, that they could actually be a lot better than that. But that's going to bring us to our third and final day of action here in the NACL in Week 3, and we kicked off day number 3 with a matchup between Winthrop University and Luminosity Gaming, and once again, the expected result happening here with Luminosity picking up the 2-0 win and doing so in pretty dominant fashion. They even kept Winthrop out of their own base at the end of that game number 2. Obviously, a pretty funny finish there, but Luminosity really kind of establishing themselves, saying, yeah, we beat Near Airport. Yes, we lost to DarkZero, but we got our hard series out of the way early. There's a real chance they go undefeated from here on out in this spring split regular season, and nobody is going to be really surprised if that ends up happening. They looked awesome here, and Winthrop didn't really have an answer, but to be fair, that's kind of what we expected. I moved them back down to number 8 in my power rankings at the end of last week because, I just felt like I was maybe a little bit too bullish after their win in week number 1. It was really nice to see them pick up that victory over Blue Otter, but a lot of that series was Blue Otter kind of making some mistakes and Winthrop doing a decent job of playing around mobility and only 35, and I'm just actually concerned about the rest of this team. Sword has at times looked good over the course of this split. I thought he was okay, actually pretty good in week number 2, but they're just not a complete package right now, and they certainly don't have the talent to go toe-to-toe with Luminosity. So let's go ahead and go over it. Player of the series for me has got to go to Insanity. I honestly didn't even consider anybody else for player of the series here. I think Tactical was excellent, and clearly the scoreline looks great from him. I think Fake God was really good on the top side, even if the scoreline doesn't indicate that for him, but the guy who really brought it all together for me was Insanity in the mid lane. He's had this Casio banned out pretty regularly against him over the course of this split, finally gets it in game number 2, and man, does he pop off. But it's not just game 2. He takes over on the Talia in game number 1, looks incredible on that champion, being able to move around the map. We know that Insanity is at his best when he gets to play this main character's super aggressive style, and obviously Tomio helps that, but I think it's really kind of lost on people just how good this guy is at times. He's not even playing the things that got him really popular in the first place, or the things that kind of got him famous in the first place, like the Graves, or these more AD bruiser type of mid laners that, he really kind of showed off on for a really long time. He played top laners in the mid lane super consistently when he was in the LCS and even before that. And so, I'm interested to see if he's going to continue to play these mages at a high level, because if he's going to be able to do that, there's really not a big weakness in his game. We called him the number 1 mid laner heading into the split. I think Pobelter and Spyrax have maybe been a tad bit more impressive, at least to me, at the beginning here, but it's not like Insanity's taking a gigantic backseat. It's just that the mid laners at the top of the NACL are ridiculous at the current moment, and he is a big reason for that. But Tactical was still good here. Tactical and Zazel really are starting to develop a nice little 2v2 synergy down on the bot side. Tactical's a great late game carry for this team. Insanity is going to be more of that space opener, if you want to put it that way, where he's going to play really aggressive in the mid game, move around the map, and try to create options, for the team to be able to generate leads. Tactical is that insurance policy that just pays all of that off at the end of the game, and I think it's a really nice setup. It's clear he's not trying to do too much for the team at the moment. I really do think that there is a universe where he's just winning by 500 gold every game going into 15 minutes, and there's just no way to play around it, but it's clear that's not the style that Luminosity want to go for, even if he probably has the talent to do so, and so you just kind of have to live with how well he's playing now. Zazel was really good on the Alistair in particular in game number 2. Fake God completely decimated Denethor. I know the scoreline doesn't show that Fake God was the most involved in this series, but that top lane matchup was not even remotely playable for Denethor. Fake God looks like the player to beat outside of maybe Zamudo on that side of the map, and, you know, trust me, like, I already really like Zamudo, but Fake God is a player that I've gone on and on and on about on this channel over the past few years. Tomio got caught out a couple of times on the Pantheon in Game 2, but you live with that, especially because the creation was still there. Luminosity dominated this series. You can point to anybody in a positive way. And then for Winthrop on the other side, it's a really easy equation. It's just mobility and only 35 are kind of the carries of this team, and it's really difficult for them to be consistent when they're not winning in the bot lane. Even if they're just like losing a little bit, even if they're going neutral, it's really hard for this team to play around anyone else as a power point on the map, and that's become abundantly clear. It doesn't really help that top lane did not go your way. Denethor is going to get dead of the series here for me. Fake God was way better in terms of the 1v1. We already talked about how he was undervalued on the other side. That's because Denethor, I think, really gave him a lot of resources. That Cassante and Bessa matchup in Game 1 was not great, and the Ornn was entirely useless in Game number 2. I don't think it did a single thing throughout that entire game. Like, truly just a net negative, like a 5v4 type of pick for Denethor in Game number 2. And I think Ornn can be valuable. It just really was not. You're relying on Wilson to honestly be the primary option in this game as the late game carry on Viego, because you pick Ahri, you pick Misfortune. You don't really have these consistent tools to play through in the back half of the game, and I think that takes you out of your own comfort zone. As I've already stated, Wilson wasn't bad. He did create for the team, and you know, they found some picks with only 35 and Wilson moving around the map, but mostly that was Tomio just being super greedy and not necessarily Wilson getting fed. You know, like I said, Sword wasn't bad, but certainly worse than Insanity. Mobility wasn't bad, but certainly worse than Tactical. It's just a really easy equation where Winthrop is not as good as Luminosity, and they were never going to be able to establish that pressure unless Luminosity made a mistake, which they didn't. They were cool, calm, collected, very slow, but very methodical. Not slow in a way where they could have done more, slow in a way where they didn't give Winthrop any chance to be able to get themselves back into this game. This was a fantastic performance from Luminosity, and this does kind of prove to people that regardless of what your thoughts were at the start of the year on this team, whether you were high or low on them, they have to be considered right alongside DarkZero and Near Airport as the upper tier, the kings right now of the NACL. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the NACL week number 3, and it was a matchup between Near Airport and Supernova, where Near Airport picks up a dominant 2-0. I know we've seen a couple of really nice 2-0s over the course of this week. I think this is the first one where it's sub 30 minutes in both games, like both Game 1 and Game 2 were sub 30. That might be wrong. You know, we've seen some pretty dominant performances here, but this was a stomp from Near Airport. They were unbelievably dominant here, and it continues to be the same ways that they've won throughout the entirety of this split, but now I think they really are starting to open up a couple of different avenues. We kind of talked about it earlier on in the week, but TF Blade being willing to play things like Scion at a super high level, the Jax looking awesome in Game number 1. If he's going to be a real asset for this team, that opens everything else up. We know that Spica, Pobelter, Double Lift, even Biofrost, like, they're going to be solid. They're going to be top tier, upper echelon type of players at their own positions. But if TF Blade is also somebody who is winning on his own without the assistance of the rest of the team, that's a gigantic problem for whoever they play into. And Supernova had no answer to them in this series. There were obviously some things that they did that I think you can kind of say, I get the idea, you know, I can kind of understand where you're coming from there, but for the most part, they were outclassed everywhere. I don't think there was a single player on Supernova that played well today. I think you can kind of look at all of them. Maybe Asila is like the one player where you can look at and say, you tried, like, you weren't awful, you weren't running it, but this was not a good performance from Supernova. They've not looked good at all so far in the NACL. I think the expectations were pretty high for Ole Miss coming in here, and honestly, they've been pretty bad. 2-6, I think, does kind of do them justice in terms of what their actual tape has looked like, but we'll talk about them a bit more in a minute here as we start with Near Airport, as we typically do with the winning side. Player of the series for me is once again going to go to Pobelter in the mid lane. Broadcast ended up giving this to Spica. I liked how Spica played this series, especially in Game number 1 on the Lilia. I thought that was his better game. And the Sejuani still was fantastic. He set up a ton, and he definitely was kind of the KDA leader here for Near Airport, but Pobelter continues to be the guy in terms of setting things up for this team, whether it's the Rise in Game 1 where he's able to move around the map, or the Azir in Game 2 where he's able to just dominate in terms of the damage he's able to deal in a lot of these team fights. He's pulling bans left and right, like game in and game out for this team, and he's still the most consistent player in the entire league. There is not a single player so far in the NACL whose floor is higher than Pobelter's. I've just been been so ridiculously impressed with what he has been. I was talking a bit on stream when we were doing the OQ's co-stream about just how crazy good he was in the OQs. He's been even better in the NACL. Right now, he's like on MVP pace. He really has been that good for Near Airport. Get this guy a tier 1 job if he wants to, because, oh my god, like, this is a tier 1 mid laner, and it's not close. And obviously, Spica is a tier 1 jungler as well. We knew that coming into the year. He was the highest graded player for me coming into the NACL this year, but he's lived up to that even if he hasn't been the main character, and I think that's been the impressive part. He's been willing to play things like Sejuani and be more of a passive carry, whereas in the OQs, you know, we saw a lot more of the aggressive picks, things like Darius jungle that he was willing to try and just destroy people on. Double lift has been awesome, especially when he can get champions like Tristana and he can get those resets going. He's been fantastic as somebody you can facilitate down on the bot side. He's indexed a lot more into carries than he did in the OQs, and that's been impressive. TF Blade was awesome in this series. I honestly considered him for player of the series because the tape really was that good. Like, he played incredibly well, was way better than Stray on the other side, even if Stray did some interesting things here, but I'm so impressed with what TF Blade did. This is his best series, in my opinion, in the NACL so far. Really helped them get to 3-1. Biofrost is obviously great on Rakan and Alistair and these engage threats to set everything up. We talk about how Double Lift and, you know, Pobelter are great at capitalizing on things that are set up. Biofrost is one of the players that is setting that up, so everything just kind of going right for Near Airport, and everything kind of going wrong for Supernova. This team has not looked good at all. And I don't want to say that I was kind of right on that, but I talked about how I didn't see the collegiate teams nearly as highly as a lot of other people did. I thought that they were at least half a tier down, maybe even a full tier down from the teams I had in the middle, teams like Conviction and CCG and Blue Otter, and that's kind of been true so far. You know, there's definitely some upside to Winthrop. I certainly don't think that they have looked awful in every series, but Supernova has just not shown up so far, and I get that their schedule has been a little bit more difficult, and there was a reason they went back up to number 7 at the end of last week, but the players that I expected to do well here, they're just not doing well. Keel is going to get done to the series, completely out jungled by Spica in terms of pressure, and basically didn't really get to do anything in the back half here. Shogo and Rhino have really not been that dominant 2v2 lane that we were looking for. People hyped them up, rightfully so. Shogo in particular was someone that I was so excited to see at the tier 2 level because his mechanical ceiling is just ridiculous. The tape we've seen of him at the collegiate level has been unreal. It's not translated so far to the NACL. There have been some good moments, but it's just not been consistent at all, and he's certainly not doing well in lane, and Rhino, I think, is a part of that. Rhino has looked very weak as a support so far in the NACL. Again, tough competition. They've really had, you know, a lot of testing going on at the beginning of this split, but this bot lane and this jungle was expected to be the strength of the team, and right now they're kind of the weak part of the team, and that's not great. Stray, certainly weaker and certainly less impactful than TF Blade, but I think there were some good takeaways. Asila was probably the most consistent player on the team, but once again, Pobelter just has way more pressure and is a way better mid laner, and so how are you ever going to be able to keep up with that? It just feels difficult for Supernova to be able to compete, but this is a top 3 team, and as we've said throughout this entire video, and really throughout this entire split, the top 3 teams are kind of untouchable at the NACL level right now. It's really a 3-horse race for the number 1 team, and Supernova is just not even close to that level, but Near Airport has really found their groove. It feels like all 5 players are playing at a strong level right now, and they've shown they can play multiple different styles, and they can flex these players around into a couple of different, you know, avenues, even with bans being targeted in multiple different ways. I've been very impressed by Near Airport, and this was a fantastic week for them. Alright, but that is going to do it for my NACL Week 3 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 3 weeks of action. We're almost done with ties here in the NACL as we start to really break through in terms of game score. We still have 1, it's Blue Otter and CCG in 7th place. Of course, the only tie is broken alphabetically. I'm not trying to show any favoritism, at least in the standings. That's what the power rankings are for, which you can see to the right of every single team. Power rank is where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 10. I would normally say change is where you can see how they have moved from last week to this week, but no shocks this week. Everything kind of went as expected. No changes in my power rankings. Everything is going to stay the same for now. It's very clear that DarkZero, Luminosity, and Near Airport are the 3 best teams in the NACL, and right now I feel pretty confident about the order that they're in. Obviously, Near Airport losing to Luminosity, Luminosity losing to DarkZero. It just kind of feels like the ladder has been pretty clear in terms of where we're at right now. DarkZero was clearly number 1. Near Airport looked awesome this week. There's a chance they could be number 2 by the end of the split. There's a chance any of those 3 could be number 1 by the end of the split, but for now, you know, it feels pretty easy to put them in that order, and I just didn't feel confident enough in any of the losses that the other teams had to move them up or down. Conviction didn't look great, but Near Airport looked great. You know, you obviously have CCG getting destroyed by DarkZero, but DarkZero is the best team in the league. You have Blue Otter, who did take a game off of Luminosity, but honestly, it was kind of gifted to them, and their 2 losses were not particularly good. It didn't really feel right to move any of those guys up, especially, you know, in comparison to each other, so I'm just leaving them where they were at the beginning of the week. Same thing for Supernova and Winthrop, neither of whom looked particularly good, but I don't think either of them look all that good in general. Like, Winthrop, I think, has looked better in terms of the form. I would expect Supernova to be better, and I think they were in week 2, but Supernova, once again, getting slaughtered this week is not ideal. AMI actually did look okay, but they're going to stay at number 9 because the teams that they're beating, I just don't know how consistent they're going to be able to beat them. Now, if Supernova continues kind of their downward trajectory, or if Winthrop also underperforms, is AMI the 7th best team in the league? Yeah, you could make the argument that that is the case right now. I just need to see a little bit more. There is a chance that they're done in terms of their winning for the rest of this split, so I'm going to keep them at 9 in terms of hesitancy for now, and then Pulse is very clearly number 10. I don't think I have to explain that, but let me know if you agree or disagree with the no changes in terms of the power rankings this week. I'm always curious to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on stuff like that down below, but let's go ahead and move into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 3. Player of the week was super easy for me. This is going to go to Pobelter, the mid laner for Near Airport. He was the best player in the league this week, and he's arguably been the best player in the league over the course of this split. I know that Near Airport hasn't looked fantastic in every series, although it's really just been that one series against Luminosity, but even in that series, Pobelter was the best player by far on Near Airport. He continues to draw a ridiculous amount of bans and continues to be the most consistent player in the entirety of the NACL. Very easy choice, in my opinion, for player of the week. He was awesome in week number 3, and then my 2 honorable mentions, my 2 runner-ups, they're going to be the 2 Luminosity gaming players, Insanity, the mid laner, and Tactical, the AD carry. This team was awesome to watch over the course of this week, and both of them had different moments where I think they shined more than the other. Insanity probably kind of got the nod. It's why his name is a little bit higher here in terms of the honorable mentions, but both of them definitely deserve to be on this list. So Tactical and Insanity as my honorable mentions, and Pobelter as my player of the week. And then my dud of the week, also kind of an easy choice, unfortunately. It's going to go to Aljun, who just got obliterated by DarkZero. And that CCG series was a little bit rough to watch just in general, but Aljun dropping 15 deaths across 2 games, it was not a good look. Like, he was abused in both of those performances. I know there's something in there to pull out. He is a good enough player where I expect this to get better, and it's totally fine to lose to DarkZero. That's certainly not some sort of, like, a panic warning sign or anything like that, but how could I give dud of the week to anybody else? Those 2 games were pretty tragic. So Aljun's gonna get dud of the week, and Pobelter is gonna get my player of the week. But that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be posting about the NACL every single week on this channel, but we've got more content coming out even later today. My LCK weekly recap video is coming out later today, and then, of course, later on in the week, we've got LTA North, LEC. We already posted the LPL. We cover everything around here. If you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.